Good morning, everybody. Time for a cup of Jonah. Appreciate you joining me. So grab your warm cup. So yesterday, if you remember, good morning, Infinite. Yesterday, if you remember, we were talking about the two premises in the first argument, namely that every mover is moved by another. Everything that's moved is moved by another. And that the second proposition, which we're going to touch today, is that there can't be an infinite succession of movers. There has to, at some point, be a first unmoved mover. Let's find out why he says that. But first, of course, the reminder that most of you don't need. Don't forget to share and like it if you do like it. But also check out phoneboothpodcast.substack.com, where, of course, you can find all the wonderful podcasts there from all of the gentlemen and now a lady over at Phone Booth Productions. So many good things there. All right, so the second proposition, namely that there is no procession to infinity among movers and things moved, Aristotle proves in three ways. The first is as follows. If among movers and things moved we proceed to infinity, all these infinite beings must be bodies, for whatever is moved is divisible and a body, as is proved in the physics. But every body that moves, something moved is itself moved while moving it. Therefore, all these infinites are moved together while one of them is moved. But one of them, being finite, is moved in a finite time. Therefore, all these infinites are moved in a finite time. This, however, is impossible. It is therefore impossible that among movers and things moved, one can proceed to infinity. Thanks for reposting, Infinite. Furthermore, that it is impossible for the above-mentioned infinites to be moved in a finite time, Aristotle proves as follows. The mover and the thing moved must exist simultaneously. This Aristotle proves by induction in the various species of motion. But bodies cannot be simultaneous except through continuity and contiguity. Now, since, as has been proved, all the aforementioned movers and things moved are bodies, they must constitute by continuity and contiguity a sort of single mobile. In this way, one infinite is moved in a finite time. This is impossible, as is proved in the physics. The second argument proving the same conclusion is the following. In an ordered series of movers and things moved, this is a series in which one is moved by another according to an order. Morning, Ted. It is necessary the fact that when the first mover is removed or ceases to move, no other mover will move or be moved. For the first mover is the cause of motion for all the others. But if there are movers and things moved following in order to infinity, there will be no first mover, but all would be as intermediate movers. Therefore, none of the others will be able to be moved, and thus nothing in the world will be moved. The third proof comes to the same conclusion, except that by beginning with the superior, it has a reverse order. It is as follows. That which moves as an instrumental cause cannot move unless there be a principal moving cause. But if we proceed to infinity among movers and things moved, all movers will be as instrumental causes, because they will be moved movers, and there will be nothing as a principal mover. Therefore, nothing will be moved. Now, instrumental cause, it's interesting. He says there are four major causes: the final cause, or the purpose of something; the formal cause, which is the what something is; the material cause, so what is something composed of, I guess you could say; and then the efficient cause, or the agent cause, also known as instrumental cause. Such then is the proof of both propositions as summed up by Aristotle in the first demonstrative way, by which he proved that the first unmoved mover exists. So in other words, he was saying all things move simultaneously. So like if my soul is moving my hand, and that my hand is then moving this cup to take a drink of the cup, and then of Jonah, and then the coffee is moving into me. Notice all of that movement happens simultaneously. So he's saying you can't have an infinite number of things that are moving simultaneously, because then there would be no origin, because they'd all be tools or efficient causes or agent causes or instrumental causes of everything else. So everything would be an instrument to something else, and then there would be no source or origin of the movement. The second way is this: if every mover is moved, this proposition is true either by itself or by accident. Again, accident meaning outside of the intention. If by accident, then it is not necessary, since what is true by accident is not necessary. It is something possible, therefore, that no mover is moved. But if a mover is not moved, it does not move, as the adversary says. It is therefore possible that nothing is moved. For if nothing moves, nothing is moved. This, however, Aristotle considers to be impossible, namely that any time there be no motion. Therefore, the first proposition was not possible, since a false possible, a false impossible, from a false possible, a false impossible does not follow. Hence, this proposition, every mover is moved by another, was not true by accident. Again, if two things are accidentally joined in some being, and here accidental means not essential, like intrinsic or necessary to the thing, but something outside of it, something on the more surface. If two things are accidentally joined in some being, and one of them is found without the other, it is probable that the other can be found without it. For example, if white and musical, those are two accidents, meaning it's not essential that any man be white or musical. If white and musical are found in Socrates, and in Plato we find musical but not white, it is probable that in some other being we can find the white without the musical. Therefore, if mover and the thing moved are accidentally joined in some being, and the thing moved be found without the mover in some being, it is probable that the mover is found without that which is moved. Nor can the example of two things, of which one depends on the other, be brought as an objection against this. For the union we are speaking of is not essential, but accidental. But if the proposition that every mover is moved is true by itself, something impossible or awkward likewise follows. And inconveniente, inconvenient, is the Latin root again that we've seen before for that word awkward. It's kind of an interesting translation. For the mover must be moved either by the same kind of motion as that by which he moves, or by another. If the same, a cause of alteration must itself be altered. And further, a healing must itself be healed, and a teacher must himself be taught. and this with respect to the same knowledge. Now, this is impossible. A teacher must have science, whereas he who is a learner of necessity does not have it. So that if the proposition were true, the same thing would be possessed and not possessed by the same being, which is impossible. So in other words, he's saying, if every teacher was also simultaneously a student in the same respect, then there would be no teacher with the knowledge to teach. If, however, the mover is moved by another species of motion, so that, namely, the altering cause is moved according to place, and the cause moving according to place is increased, and so forth, since the genera and species of motion are finite in number, it will follow that we cannot proceed to infinity. There will thus be a first mover which is not moved by other. In other words, in the case of teaching, so you would have to say in this case that, okay, yeah, well, maybe the teacher is a student, and it's kind of more by degrees. So the teacher is teaching the student because he has more knowledge. But then that teacher, you could say, is a student with respect to some other teacher who has still more knowledge. So if it's a difference of degree, but not of kind, right, then it's clear that at some point you reach a max. At some point you have to reach an end to it. There has to be one that it has a knowledge sufficient that there is no other teacher to teach it, to make that teacher a student, so to speak, right? Will someone say that there will be a recurrence, so that when all the genera and species of motion have been completed, the series will be repeated and returned to the first motion? This would involve saying, for example, that a mover according to place would be altered, the altering cause would be increased, and the increasing cause would be moved according to place. Yet this whole view would arrive at the same conclusion as before. Whatever moves according to a certain species of motion is itself moved according to the same species of motion, though mediately and not immediately. So again, with the example of me drinking coffee, there's a different type of, it's all the same type of motion, right? So there's several different kinds of motion. A motion of according to place, a motion according to in a motion in being, and I think a motion according to act as well. It remains, therefore, that we must posit some first mover that is not moved by any exterior moving cause. Granted this conclusion, namely that there is a first mover that is not moved by an exterior moving cause, it yet does not follow that this mover is absolutely unmoved. So now he's asking, well, okay, now we understand that of the same species of motion, like local motion, motion of place, or physical motion, you could say, there can't be an infinite series, but maybe then it just kind of changes to a different species of motion. So he's trying to exhaust all the possibilities before coming to the conclusion. That is why Aristotle goes on to say that the condition of the first mover must be twofold. The first mover can be absolutely unmoved. If so, we have the conclusion we are seeking. There is a first unmoved mover. On the other hand, the first mover can be self-moved. This may be argued because that which is through itself is prior to what is through another. Hence, among things moved as well, it seems reasonable that the first moved is moved through itself and not by another. But on this basis, the same conclusion again follows. For it cannot be said when a mover moves itself, when a mover moves himself, the whole is moved by the whole. Otherwise, the same difficulties would follow as before. One person would both teach and be taught, and the same would be true among other motions. It would also follow that a being would be both in potency and in act. For a mover, as such in act, is as such in act, whereas the thing moved is in potency. Consequently, one part of the self-moved mover is solely moving, and the other part is solely moved. We thus reach the same conclusion as before. There exists an unmoved mover. Nor can it be held that both parts of the self-moved mover are moved, so that one is moved by the other, or that one moves by both itself and the other, or that the whole moves a part, or that a part moves the whole. All this would involve the return of the aforementioned difficulties. Something would both move and be moved according to the same species of motion. Something would be at once in potency and in act. And furthermore, the whole would not be primarily moving itself, it would move through the motion of a part. The conclusion thus stands: one part of a self-moved mover must be unmoved, and moving the other part. So here, it may sound a little laborious, but you can see that he's really just trying to diligently exhaust all the possibilities and say, okay, well, if we know that one thing moves another, and everything that is moved or is moving is necessarily moved by another thing, it can't regress infinitely in the same kind of motion, because then there would be no one thing in act. Because remember, we said you can't give what you don't have. So that which is in act with regard to something can't bring and activate, so to speak, the potency of something that isn't yet in act in that regard. In other words, the coffee is in my cup, but it's potentially in me. And so if there's nothing that can physically move it or apply that movement, that potency, and bring it to act so that it's in me, then it won't ever arrive, right? So this concept of act and potency is really important. It'll come up again and again and again. Remember, we'll see, you remember the joke that the reason why Thomas wrote these books is so that someone challenged him to write. He wanted to see how big of a book he could write with the smallest number of words, right? So we'll revisit the same concepts again and again. There are certain difficult for us in our Western now, modern isn't the right word, contemporary usage of these words. Accidental means outside the intention, or it means outside of my essence of me. So like in the example he gave, white and musical is an accident. It's outside of the essence of what it is to be Jonah, right? Because Jonah could be not musical, or Jonah, or a person could be not white, right? So these are it's important to understand that there's the words in how philosophically in the thought of Aristotle they're used. We'll get more familiar with these words as we go, but this idea of act and potency is really important, and maybe something good to kind of reflect on today. So potency is defined as that which is able to be reduced to act. So think of it as has the power. So potency comes from the word for power, right? So it has the power or the ability to be something that it currently is not, right? I have the potency to be more musical than I am. I have the potency to, God forbid, die, right? that's within the power of my being to no longer exist because I'm a composite being. So potency is ability, and it can be everything from this coffee's in the cup and has the potency of moving, and so I can move it and throw it on the floor, or I can move it and throw it down the hatch, so to speak, right? So this is something. So these are words we'll get more familiar with. Shiva says, back when words meant something and people didn't get away saying the opposite of what they meant, like in today's time. Exactly, Shiva. Exactly. That's something that's really important as well, is that we have this brain rot or this poison that we've just been culturally taught to accept, which is, we could call it subjectivism or modernism. Subjectivism as well. Oh, well, my truth. No. There's your perception of what is truth and your opinions of what truth are, but truth is one. Either God exists or he doesn't. Either evolution happened or it didn't. There's a truth there. We can't each have our own version of reality and they both be true. Reality is what is or it isn't, right? So either I exist or I don't. Either I'm live and we're all reading this stuff and pondering these ideas together right now, or we're not. The vast majority of people in the world today have no concept, have no idea that we're streaming live right now and talking about these concepts. But that doesn't make it less true that we are. Why, God forbid, everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. The acceptance of death gives life immense value. You're right. It's a turn of phrase. I just didn't want to curse myself by saying, I don't know. You're not wrong, Shiva. You're not wrong. No, and I just hope that to that point of death, I just hope that I've lived a good enough life. I just hope that I've lived a good life, so that when I die, I'm ready, so to speak. So I feel there's more I have yet to accomplish. I have more value to give to the world that I haven't yet. I have more wrongs to right, but I digress. But yeah, so don't be discouraged if at first some of this vocabulary is not, because it's not the way that we're used to saying words. The vestige of the original meanings are still there. For example, I got in a car accident because you hit something or something else hit you, which wasn't anybody's intention. So it was outside of your intention. Again, to use this poor coffee as an example, let's say I'm walking to come here and sit down with you and the cup slips out of my hand and I spill coffee all over the floor. That was an accident. It was outside of my intention, right? So that's one that usage of the word accidental comes a little more naturally and understandably to us. The other sense of the word accidental, which means, so now think of the similarities though. Accident outside of my intention, or accident outside of my being. So musical, or whiteness, or Americanness in Jonah is accidental to what it is to be a human being, to what it is to be this particular human being. It happens to, all three of those happen to be part of who I am, but none of them are essential. In other words, I wouldn't cease to be Jonah if I somehow just woke up one morning and forgot that any musical talent that I have, however limited it may be, right? Or I get a terrible, a very heavy tan or something, and I cease to be white in some way, right? Or I'm a lot less white because of too much time in the sun, right? That doesn't change who I am. It's accidental. Again, it's outside. You see the parallel. It's outside of my being, like spilling the coffee would be outside of my intention. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Again, don't be discouraged, because a lot of these terms, as we get familiar with using them, they'll start to come more naturally, and we'll start to kind of think more precisely, or be able to think more precisely about these things. And when we hear, oh, accidental, we'll understand in the context whether he means outside of the intention or outside of, as like outside of the being or the essence of something. So I hope that helps. But it's a lot of fun. So tomorrow will be, I believe, do I spray tan, Shiva? I have never spray tanned. I actually have kind of a silly strategy to, at the beginning of summer, to protect myself. If I do get sunburned, I will go into a hot shower, and it hurts, absolutely hurts insanely for about 10-15 seconds, and then the sunburn doesn't hurt anymore. But no, I usually get sunburnt. At least I used to. Once I started doing the carnivore diet, I don't get sunburned the same way anymore. But okay, the Shiva, you're hilarious. So tomorrow we will actually, as we wrap up the week tomorrow morning, we'll actually be able to wrap up the third and final piece of this unmoved mover consideration and the proof of the existence of God. And then Monday, we'll go to the chapter. The chapter heading is that to know God, we must use the way of remotion. So he'll talk more about how when we think about God, we have to remove remotion. We have to kind of cut away the imperfections in the words we're using and the concepts we're using, because we're talking about a perfect being that surpasses our understanding. We can still speak intelligently about that being, but we have to understand that the terms we use, we're cutting away the imperfections in the term. Like we talked about, if we can say intelligent of God, we mean something different than the imperfect intelligence that we have, because our intelligence we arrive at through the senses and through a reasoning process. But that reasoning process is not present in this pure intellect that knows all things immediately without having to figure them out as we are now, as an example, right? So that will be explained on Monday in a much more eloquent and concise manner than I attempted to a week or so ago. But again, I so appreciate all of you for joining me for Cup of Jonah in the morning. Don't forget, do share. We're on Spotify as well. And also don't forget to check out the phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. And I do encourage you guys to subscribe if you haven't. As you can see, there's a lot more content coming out also that is available just to subscribers. So I think you guys will really appreciate a lot of that. There's some pretty neat bonus content, so to speak, there. But all of Cup of Jonah episodes will be available. Here's a question I'd like to float to you guys. What I'm thinking of doing is having some supplemental outside of this book, accidental to the work that we're, see what I did there? Accidental to the work that we're plotting our way through right now, or working our way through right now. I was thinking of possibly reading some other content as well. So for example, we could on a Saturday pick up something like that short paper by Thomas that I mentioned in one of the first episodes here of Cup of Jonah, where it's called On Being and Essence, De Enter Essentia. So that's a very technical term, but it's something that I think you guys would really appreciate. So what I'm thinking of doing is possibly that would be a longer reading. I'd like to try to do it in one sitting or so, depending. It is shorter, but I was thinking of doing something like that on a Saturday where we could just kind of read together for an hour or so. Be a little bit different than what we're doing here. But let me know if that's something that you guys would be interested in. I might do it as bonus content for folks who are subscribed, just to kind of encourage that subscription. But just thinking about it, let me know in the comments or whatnot if that's something that you would be interested in. Shiva, I appreciate you reminding folks to share and like and share the video stream. It does help and it's appreciated. If you enjoy the content as much as I do, then I would be honored if you would share it. But yes, appreciate you, Shiva, for reminding everybody. But as always, I appreciate you guys for joining me in the morning here, the highlight of my morning. And I look forward to tomorrow. Tomorrow, where we finish this chapter on the existence of God. And again, you can see it's very philosophical and grounded. It's very much from what we can sense and understand rationally. Does this thing we call God exist? Right? And we'll see towards the end as he wraps up tomorrow, as he wraps up this conversation, there's like 2 or 3 pages left. Several times he'll be like, this we call God. This we call God. This we call God. So he'll follow different arguments or different proofs, so to speak. And then we're not making any claims yet about who God is, what he is, how to work, all that. That's all secondary. First, we're just establishing that whatever this first unmoved mover is, that's what we're calling God. That thing, whatever it is, right? So then later, as you said, remember, on seat, whether it is, so that's the question we're answering now. Quo modo seat are going to be the questions that follow. In what way is God? And that's where you can see, again, being perfect in his presentation of the order of topics and the order of the chapters. As we transition from, okay, now we know that God exists on seat, we're going to now start to discuss about quo modo seat. But in order to discuss that, we have to understand how we're using words to refer to this thing we call God when we think about him. And we'll see, actually, why do I use the word him? Why does Aristotle and Thomas use the word him for God? There's a very precise philosophical reason for it, not religious, although obviously that is in many religions, that is the notion. But again, before we get into now, we're going to jump back to preliminary considerations, and it's just the one, I believe, is before we start to talk about quo modo seat, in what way, what the modality, so to speak, of that thing we call God. First, we have to understand the limitations of the language that we're going to be using to wrestle with these concepts and to kind of figure out and understand what is true about God. So, and that is by way of remotion, by cutting away imperfections in what we mean by these terms. So, very interesting. So I'm excited. Tomorrow we'll wrap up this first question on seat, whether God exists, and then we'll turn our attention next week to what ways God exists. So, well, I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Cheers. Excuse me. Goodness. God bless. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you tomorrow.